What's going on? Welcome to the episode. Today we're going to be chatting a little bit about mental health in regards to the news, because the news has been ultra relevant over the last year and a half or so with COVID, the US election, and I've noticed a beneficial shift in my mental health as well as some of my clients who have changed some of their consumption patterns around the news. So, what originally sparked myself to take a closer look at the information that I was consuming was an experience that I had in San Diego about 4 years ago. So San Diego is super close to the Mexican border by Tijuana, and folks take day trips from San Diego to Tijuana all the time because it's that close. And I was thinking about taking a day trip. However, I then had heard the president at the time had shut down the border and that there were 8+ hour waits and no one could cross. This was all over the major news networks. So I decided not to go. Later that evening, I ran into a few of my friends and we got to chatting, and I asked them what they had gotten up to that day. And they mentioned that they had gone down to Tijuana for a day trip, and I was super confused. So I asked them, I was like, were you stuck at the border? I was under the impression that everything was shut down. And they said, no, we cruised right through both ways. I was like, okay, that's odd. It turns out that I was very naive at the time, and I assumed that if the news was reporting something, it had to be true, which I was absolutely wrong about. The border hadn't been shut down at all, but for whatever reason, the news network that I had been watching reported that that was the case. The second experience that I had was living in Playa del Carmen in Mexico, and a friend of mine texted me to ask me if everything was okay because he had heard that there was a shooting right outside of Playa, and I actually hadn't heard anything about it. But I looked at the article that he sent me, and the title of the article read something like "Shooting Near Playa del Carmen." But when I read the actual article, the shooting had taken place about 5 or 6 hours south of Playa del Carmen, closer to Belize. But when I got to thinking about it, I realized that's not a very relevant or interesting story for the news to report in Canada or the US, because very few tourists, if any, visit that specific area of Mexico. So the author, or whoever decided on the title of the article, clearly wanted to generate as many clicks as possible by saying close to Playa, because a lot of Canadians and Americans travel there for vacation. Now, these experiences brought up one of the most important realizations that I had in regards to the news. The news is a business, first and foremost. Their number one priority is not informing the public necessarily. They have to make money because otherwise, like any other business, they can't exist. They are funded, like many other businesses, via ad revenue, which isn't inherently bad at all. It's just important to be aware of. Otherwise, you're going to naively assume, like I did, that the news is factual, when unfortunately that is just not the case at all. As humans, our number one inclination is survival, meaning if something is a threat to living, we are designed to pay very close attention to it. And the news understands this evolutionary tendency and they use it to their advantage, which you really can't fault them for because, again, they're a business. And if folks consume their product, they are going to provide more and more of that product. So you can think about the news sort of like a drug dealer, except they don't sell drugs. They sell fear. And the easiest way to distinguish this is just by looking at the type of stories that get reported. You rarely hear about all of the incredible things that humans do for one another on a daily basis. You hear about all the fucked up shit that's happening, and it paints a picture that all of that stuff is not only happening, but it's essentially happening in your backyard or down the street, which just isn't true. This matters because the information that we consume is like food for our brain. It can be healthful single ingredient whole food, or it can be ultra processed junk food, and everything in between. So if you're consuming fear, that's going to impact your brain and mental health to a massive degree. Just like if you're consuming pizza. There are some serious repercussions to that. We all know folks in their 70s and 80s that watch the news all day long and barely leave their homes because they believe that the world is a cruel and dangerous place, and it can be. But there's way more good going on in the world on a day-to-day basis than bad, and it's only getting better. We may not perceive it that way, But here are a few stats that I think that you'll find interesting. Comparing the United States today versus 30 years ago, the homicide rate has declined from 8.5 per 100,000 to 5.3 per 100,000. So it's almost halved. The poverty rate has declined from 12% to 7%. Pollution has declined from 35 million tons of particulate matter to 21 million tons of particulate matter, and from 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide to 4 million tons of sulfur dioxide. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's just the US, the world as a whole is getting worse. So here are a few worldwide numbers. Comparing the world now to 30 years ago, there are around 10 ongoing wars today, and 30 years ago, there were 23. There are 60 autocracies today, whereas there were 85 30 years ago. And an autocracy is a system of government controlled by one person with absolute power. So an example would be North Korea. 30 years ago, extreme poverty worldwide was at 37%. It's at just under 10% today. 30 years ago, there were 60,000 nuclear weapons. Today, there are only 10,000. Now, if you're curious as to where I got these stats, I got them from Steven Pinker's work, which I'd highly recommend. He is a world-renowned cognitive psychologist. Big fan of his work. So if that's not progress, I honestly don't know what is. But when you watch the news, the picture that is painted is completely different, and that informs your worldview, what you believe, how you act, your levels of anxiousness, how well you sleep. Again, what are you feeding your brain? That's the big question that I want to pose in this episode. We're all well aware that what we feed our bodies is super important, and I've dedicated a large part of my life to learning about it and helping folks implement it. And what you feed your brain is just as important, because as you've heard me say in other episodes, the physical, mental, and emotional bodies are all inextricably linked. Your physical health impacts your mental and emotional health. Your mental health impacts your physical and emotional health, and your emotional health impacts your mental and physical health. These are not separate compartments. They're more of a Venn diagram with health sitting at the center of it. Now, it's worth mentioning that if you're one of those folks that just really likes to stay informed, that is totally cool, and I get it. There are a few things that I'd recommend in a scenario like this. One being, if you do choose to watch the news, the most reliable way to know what's true and what's not is if both sides of the media are reporting the same story with the same facts, okay? So an example of this would be if Fox and CNN were talking about the same event and the events as well as the statistics match up. Now, if, for example, Fox and CNN are reporting different things regarding the same event, the truth likely is somewhere in the middle because news outlets have biases as well. They back certain policies and candidates, and they're heavily invested in the political landscape. And so it's really important that when the two sides are reporting differently, that you take that information with a massive grain of salt. I actually see this in nutrition science all the time. The same study or information can be interpreted completely differently depending on who's looking at the results, because a lot of the time the individual looking at those results wants the outcome to turn out a certain way. But unfortunately, that is not how true science is done. Let's take a vegan and a carnivore diet as an example. These two diets couldn't be more different because a vegan diet excludes all animal products and a carnivore diet excludes all plant products. And the truth is that humans are omnivorous, meaning we're designed to be able to eat plants and animals because animals have nutrients that plants don't have and vice versa. Now, under certain circumstances, a vegan diet or a carnivore diet may be the best fit for an individual at a specific point in time for a specific purpose or outcome. But for the vast majority of people, a middle-of-the-road approach when it comes to food options is the sweet spot. The same concept applies to the news. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle. So if you do decide to continue watching the news, I'd recommend watching left-leaning news outlets as well as the right-leaning outlets, because like I mentioned before, that's really the only way to know if you're getting the truth due to these built-in biases of both sides. We often hear that there are two sides to every story, right? There are actually three. There's your side, there's the other person's side, and then there's the truth. Personally, I choose not to consume the news anymore, and instead I listen to long-form podcasts because they have a massive advantage in the sense that ideas can really be explored and fleshed out in more detail and nuance versus a 3-minute soundbite clip on the evening news that's essentially designed to be inflammatory and super catchy. Long-form articles are another great resource because they too can delve into the details, and the details matter because let's use the example of meeting someone. First impressions are huge, right? But let's say that you met someone really quickly in a specific setting and for whatever reason, they rubbed you the wrong way and you decided not a fan of that person. And then maybe you meet them once more and have a chance to truly sit down and connect with them and learn more about where they've come from and their individual perspective and life experience. And you're like, shit, I read this one wrong. This person is really great. And I understand so much more about them now. This is short and catchy 3-minute bite-sized clips versus long-form delve into the details, nuanced information, and life is nuanced. Another thing that you can do to get a more subtle perspective of the world is to travel. Oh man, for myself, this has been the biggest piece of the perspective puzzle because I've heard so many things about so many places that turned out just not to be true, or at least very much different than my personal experience. For example, I lived in Colombia a while back and I had heard all sorts of things about Colombia, most of which were that it's just incredibly dangerous and traveling there is a bad idea. My experience was completely opposite of that. Of all the places that I've been in the world, and I think I've visited maybe 30 countries or so, of all the places, Colombia has the kindest people, period. They are amazing. I never once felt unsafe when I was living there, and I just had an incredible all-around experience. Another quick example was Paris. So many people told me how rude people were in Paris and how they didn't like tourists. Not my experience in the slightest. People were really nice and more than happy to help me out with directions or whatever I needed at the time. I had an entirely different experience than what I had heard about prior to actually going there. I could go on and on as far as examples go, but you get the idea. Hearing about someone, something, or somewhere is entirely different than experiencing it for yourself. Now, as far as specific resources go that aren't the news, my go-to resource at the moment is a podcast called Conversations with Coleman. And in my biased opinion, Coleman Hughes has a really balanced and fruitful approach and discussions with folks on both sides of the political spectrum. And he's just really thoughtful, he's thought-provoking, and a pragmatic person in general. Highly recommend. Steven Pinker is another great person to follow. He's written a bunch of books, and is just a super intelligent and thoughtful guy, and I'd recommend his work as well. I'm a huge fan of Rob Wolf, who's been on the podcast a couple times, and if you follow his podcast, The Healthy Rebellion Radio, you could sort of get the best of both worlds as far as nutrition and health stuff goes, but also current events, because he puts together these episodes called Salty Talks, where he delves into hot topics. I'd highly recommend the Healthy Rebellion Radio podcast as well, and I will link to all of these resources in the show notes for you. Now, the last thought that I'll leave you with on this whole mental health and news topic dealio is an evolutionary psychology one. Relatively speaking, the internet is super new. It's been popular-ish since the early 2000s, more or less. So let's say it's roughly 20 years old, meaning we've been evolving for millions of years without it. And I know that a lot of folks really believe that everyone should be informed on current events. But the truth is that I'm not sure that our brains are able to handle this much information about what's going on the other side of the world. For example, I'm in Vancouver, Canada right now, and I can find out about all sorts of horrible stuff happening thousands of miles away. Without the internet, that's not possible. And so I'm just not quite sold on the idea that everyone should be informed just because our brains haven't evolved to know much of what's going on outside of word of mouth and stories being passed down through the generations within our tribe. Now, I'm not anti-internet or anything like that, but the thing that I remind myself often of is My day-to-day experience is completely different than the perception that is given about the way that the world is via the news and the internet. I would say that 99.9% of my interactions on a day-to-day basis are awesome. But that is not the picture that the news paints. So this is the primary reason why I decided to stop consuming the news, because I just found that my personal experience of the world was very different than the one that the news outlets were painting. So I listen to long-form podcasts on various topics. However, I do look at it like this. If something is that important, someone's going to tell me about it. And everything else is essentially day-to-day noise. The most important events everyone finds out about, and all of the trivial moment-to-moment bullshit just fades away into the background. And I just don't think that I need to know about all of that momentary stuff. That's just my personal perspective and how I set myself up for success in regards to my mental health. Ultimately, you need to figure out what's best for you, your psychology, your life, your health, all of that good stuff. I just wanted to share my experience because I think that COVID has really shined a light onto this whole news and media topic in regards to mental health. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. And leaving a review really helps the pod grow and reach more folks. So if you're willing to do that, I truly appreciate it. And if you've already left a review, thank you so much. Lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.